For many people and for many generations, the question that they have about God, faith, Jesus, Christianity has been, is it true? Is the message, is the story, is it really true? And that's an understandable question. It's actually a really good question. I'm a natural born skeptic myself. I question everything to the extent that it can really be a character flaw at times. And so like if you have doubts, if you have questions, I love to talk about things like that. Especially I love to talk about the it part of that question, like exactly what is the it? That you're wondering if it's true, because many of us were raised with various beliefs and various ideas that were really like a house of cards, just like precariously constructed. And as soon as one of those cards began to get tugged on or questioned or doubted a little bit, the entire house seems to collapse. And that's a conversation, I think, for maybe another day and another series, and we talk about those kinds of things a lot. But I would just say perhaps the it that you need to wrestle with just might actually be a different it than you think you need to wrestle with. But is it true? I think that's a reasonable question. That's an understandable question. That's a great question. But more and more in our day, the question that many people are asking is it good? Is it good? Even if it is true or true-ish, like based on a true story, partially true, is it good? Is this message good? Is it like good for society? Is it good for the world? Is it good for women? Is it good for children? Is it good for the marginalized, for the oppressed? Is it good for people, or is it dangerous? Is it actually harmful and toxic? In fact, since the early 2000s, when a movement arose called the New Atheists, there have been a wave of renowned skeptics with best-selling books that have argued that religion in general and Christianity in particular is actually bad. Bad for the world, bad for history, bad for people, that religion in general, and again, Christianity in particular, is the source of evil and injustice and oppression and racism and bigotry and sexism and violence and war and ignorance. In fact, immediately after 9/11, a neuroscientist named Sam Harris, who's one of kind of the founding members of this movement, wrote a book called The End of Faith. The subtitle is Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. It is a scathing critique, not of Islam, as one might have expected right after 9/11, but of all religion. Well, publishers rejected this book. The assumption was people would not want an anti-religion book right after 9/11, and if you were alive at the time, you might understand why publishers thought that. But finally, a publisher picked it up, and that book spent 33 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. As you can imagine, at the Times, he got a lot of backlash for it, thousands of letters written to him, a number of them from Christians. And so he decided to publish a follow-up book, a letter in response to the letters he had received from Christians, called A Letter to a Christian Nation, talking now to Christians specifically, saying, you and your beliefs are the problem with the world. The very next year after this book, 2007, a journalist named Christopher Hitchens published a book, the title of which is God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. You can kind of see where he's going with that. It too was a best-selling book detailing his arguments against God and faith and religion, all religion, and especially the atrocities, great and small, committed throughout the centuries in the name of religion. His conclusion in the book, as you might guess, is that religion really is the problem. That it's bad. Another one of the New Atheists, a very famous man, Richard Dawkins, a biologist, writes, a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, similar to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Which raises a question, is that true? Is that true? Are they right? How could we know for sure? And many in our generation assume that it is true, that they are right from what they've been told and from the evidence they've seen. And so many people find themselves walking away, or at least if not walking away, kind of distancing themselves from God, faith, Bible, Jesus, not necessarily because of whether or not it's true, not necessarily embracing atheism, but because Christianity, or at least the version that they have been exposed to, is increasingly unattractive, unappealing, undesirable, and maybe that's you, or maybe that's somebody you know. And sadly, in fact, horribly, there has been way too much evidence and way too many examples. And by the way, just one example of that would be too many examples, but there have been many more than one example, ancient and current, of people who have associated their names with God, faith, religion, Jesus, Christianity, abusing power, abusing people, covering it up, failing to listen to victims, failing to be a voice for the voiceless. Plenty of examples to add fuel to the suspicions and fears and the revulsions that sometimes people have. And I get that. But what you need to know, and what maybe no one has ever told you before, is that the original Jesus and the original Jesus movement launched a wave of world-changing good that positively transformed every value, every assumption, every ideal, every institution that we hold dear, from social justice and racial equality to women and children's rights, to education and hospitals and orphanages, to modern science, to our core values of human dignity and equality and compassion and freedom and humility, all of which exist today because of Jesus and the Jesus movement that he launched. In fact, there's a real irony to the criticisms launched by many of these authors that a number of people have pointed out, and that is that the standard, the very values and ideas by which Hitchens and Harris and others judge and dismiss Christianity, and by the way, rightly so, should be judged by ideals of justice and love and mercy and compassion and integrity and charity and humility and concern for the powerless and the oppressed and the voiceless and the evils of war and violence and the value of human life and human equality, ideals which we should be held up to, are actually only in existence in the world as they are today because of Christianity. Let me say that once again. The ideals that we hold of justice, love, mercy, compassion, and the way we think about these, charity, giving to someone without expecting something in return, generosity, humility, equality, freedom, the concern for powerless and oppressed peoples, the evils of war and violence, the value of human life and human dignity are only in existence in our world the way they are because of Christianity. In other words, the only reason that Christopher Hitchens and others could judge Christianity so harshly is because Christianity had been so effective at creating the moral water in which they simply assume and swim in. Now, part of the problem with all of this discussion is a word that I've used a few times, and I often try to refrain from using it because it carries so much baggage. This word right here, Christian, which I almost always want to put like air quotes around it because that word means so many different things to so many different people. I mean, if you ask 10 people what they think of the word Christian, you are going to get 10 different responses, and they will not all be emotionally neutral. There will be some emotion attached to how people think of that word and of the related word Christianity. And part of the reason why is because this word has become a religion. Now, it didn't start out that way. It actually started out as the unreligion, but over centuries, it became not only a religion, but the largest religion in the world. Billions and billions of people, roughly a third of the population of this planet, associate themselves in one way or another with that word. People who believe all sorts of things, say all sorts of things, do all sorts of things, are for and against all sorts of things and all sorts of people. This word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it can be very hard to define. In fact, it kind of means anything you want it to mean, and it can kind of be applied to almost anything you want to apply it to, from a business to a bumper sticker. Anything can be Christian. Now, part of the problem with that, and you might find this interesting, I don't know, maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't know this, that word, part of the problem with understanding the definition of that word is that word actually only appears 3 times in the entire collection of documents that we call the Bible. Just 3 times, never on the lips of insiders, only on the lips of outsiders. And in other words, Jesus never used this word and never defined it. And his first followers never used this word, at least never in their own words to apply to themselves, and they never defined it. Instead, they used a different word. And this word, this is a very specific, and this is a much more demanding, in fact, it's a scarier word than Christian. The word they use to refer to themselves is disciple. Disciple. And that word means something. A disciple is a learner, a pupil, a student, an apprentice, a follower of someone, and specifically a student or a follower in the way of Jesus, which is how they referred to their movement, not Christianity. They were just followers of the way, and specifically the way of life of Jesus himself. And one of the reasons why that word is so easily defined and so precise and so demanding and honestly so scary is that Jesus himself defined that word. It's a famous scene. It's actually the last night of his life. He's before he was crucified, he's having a conversation with his closest followers, his disciples, if you will, and he says this to them as part of a meal: "A new command I give you." This night, they're like, "Hey, here's the deal. I'm giving you a new command. Love one another," which wasn't exactly new yet, but he was about to make it new. He gets real specific and he says, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another. As I have loved, so you must love. As I have, so you must," which they would have thought as they heard that, well, of course. Of course, that's what a disciple does. A disciple does exactly what their master, mentor, teacher does. They do what they see being modeled for them. That's what it means to be a disciple. Of course, Jesus, as you have done something, that is what we must do. And then he says this: "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples." So how will they know we're Christians? How will they know we're Christians? I mean, that question comes up a lot. I hear that question a lot. How will they know we're Christians if we don't fill in the blank? If we're not filling in the, how will they know if there are no crosses on our building, if there are no bumper stickers on our cars, if there's no Bible on my desk, if I'm not listening to that kind of music, but I'm listening to this guy? How will they know we're Christians if we're not standing up for this issue or against that issue? How will they know? How will they know that we're Christians? Jesus says, hey, great question. Let me answer that for you. If you love one another. That's how to know. Specifically, if you love as I have loved you, and they see that in you and from you. In other words, sacrificial, I got your back kind of love, one-sided kinds of love, of like, it may not be coming back to me, but that's okay. Tough love, but not tough love as in, I'm gonna be tough on you kind of love, but man, this love is gonna be tough on me. It's going to be tough on me. It's going to be sacrificial. It is going to be hard to do, but I am going to love you anyway, even when it's hard. That's how people will know, and get this. And they did. They actually did it. And so in city after city, these selfless, crazy, like generous communities just began to spring up all over the place. And the Jesus movement caught on like wildfire. In fact, there are a number of authors who have detailed, just from a historical perspective, exactly what happened in those first few centuries and how it came about. Authors like Alvin Schmidt, great book, Triumph of Christianity, The Air We Breathe, that's a book I'm reading right now. Bullies and Saints, John Dixon, brilliant, wicked smart Tom Holland, and his book, Dominion, how the Christian Revolution remade your world. I mean, just book after book detailing how all of this happened. One of these books is written by a sociologist named Rodney Stark, and he wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, and the subtitle is, I love the subtitle. The subtitle is How the Obscure Marginalized Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. And he's just examining, from a sociological point of view, the cause and the context of an incredible expansion. And no one doubt or denies that the expansion was just insane and its influence was incredible. According to historical estimates and Rodney Stark's own research, he would say that around 40 AD, maybe 1/1000th of 1% of the entire population of the Roman Empire were followers of Jesus, adopted this way. But 300 years later, 56% of the Roman Empire was Christian. Before it was legal to be a Christian, while constantly being misunderstood, maligned, ostracized, persecuted, meeting in secret in the cover of dark. And Stark he's a sociologist, he's a professor of comparative religion, he's a scholar, and he just wants to know how did that happen? How did the obscure, marginalized Jesus movement become the dominant religious force in the Western world in just 3 centuries? Why did that happen? Was it because maybe they were better at arguing and debating about religion? I mean, they just had just crisper memes and just vicious tweets. Like, no, it wasn't that. Was it that they had more resources, more money? They just blanketed the world? No, wasn't that. Was it their buildings? Was it their political power? Was it their voting bloc? Was it their super PAC? They had none of those things. And the answer, as Stark does the research, he doesn't begin with the answer. He lets the answer unfold as he researches his question. His answer ultimately is simply this, that the followers of Jesus were more compassionate than anybody else and that anybody else had ever been. To summarize his final chapter, these are my words, not his. They simply outloved everybody. They simply outloved everybody. And Stark and many of these other authors, they just give numerous examples from history of what made the Jesus movement that eventually began to be called Christianity, or they ultimately began to call themselves Christians. But what made it so incredibly attractive and just magnetic that even while it was being violently opposed and persecuted, it was growing like crazy. And one of the reasons why many of these authors expound on is this, and this is unbelievable. They flipped the social ladder. This is seismic. They flipped the social ladder. And here's why this is just crazy and so novel. Greco-Roman society and most societies pre-Christian are strictly segregated, strictly hierarchical, kind of like junior high school. Or like who talks to who and who won't talk. Or maybe it's like more like the airline. So think of the airline. So like the Senate class and the equestrian class is the upper tiny percentage of the population. That's like first class. That's like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and hardly anybody else. That's a very tiny percentage of the population. And then right beneath them would be like regional nobility and the aristocracy, like the blue blood of various nations. And that would be kind of like second class, frankly, compared to the first, more like business class. But then you pull the curtain right behind them and you don't even get to see what those people are eating. And the rest of us are what Roman historian Tacitus called the rabble. Just turn to somebody next to you and say, you're the rabble. You're the rabble. That's Coach. That's Coach. And even Coach is highly stratified. In fact, first class is too. There are citizens, and then there are freemen, and then there are foreigners, and then there are women, and then there are slaves. And even within those categories, there's just social lines all over the place. Ethnicities and countries and armies and guilds and tribes and families and like everything created this complex system by which you knew which rung on the ladder you stood, where you belonged and where you did not belong. And who were your people and who were not your people. Kind of like the caste system, everything in society reinforced this. It's something we can't even begin to imagine. Reinforced who's up and who's down. The clothing you wore or were allowed to wear. Can you wear a tunic? Can you wear a toga? Are you allowed to? It's not a matter of whether you can afford it. Are you even allowed to? Can you wear a cap? The freemen could wear caps. Slaves couldn't wear caps. Slaves couldn't wear shoes or sandals either. Certain colors were forbidden for certain classes and so forth. Everything in society reinforced it. The order in which people were allowed to eat. So we're going to head out there and it's going to be like, there's going to be hot dogs and there's not going to be any order. It's just like the first people who get there get the first, well, it's hot dogs. So it is what it is. So that's that. But the order which you were allowed to eat, whether you were the first one there or not, all dictated by your social position, your class, and then where you sat in the temples and the festivals and the games and the theater, everything in society reinforced where the lines were and kept everybody in place, and nobody ever stepped out of that. Nobody ever mixed with anyone else. And it wasn't just the way things are. In their world, it was the way things are supposed to be. In fact, Plato, you've heard of Plato before. Plato puts it this way: nature herself intimates that it is just for the better to have more than the worst, for the powerful to have more than the weaker. Justice consists in the superior ruling over and having more than the inferior. Now, for us, justice is the pursuit of equality. For them, it was exactly the opposite, the enforcement of inequality. Just as nature obviously dictates, look around you. And then there were these communities of people who treated each other like equals, the haves and the have-nots, the uber rich, and there were uber rich among them, and the desperate and destitutely poor, the educated, and there were highly educated men and women among them, and the utterly illiterate, landowners and landlords and day laborers, men and women, Jews and non-Jews, all ethnicities. They created communities without ladders. Communities without ladders. In fact, one of the early Christians, a man you may have heard of, Paul of Tarsus, he's sometimes known as the Apostle Paul. In one of his letters, he explains what their communities are like, and he says, there is neither Jew nor Greek ethnicities. That doesn't separate us. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. In other words, all the old distinctions are gone. The social ladder has been tossed out the window. It's irrelevant in our community. In fact, Thomas Cahill, the eminent historian, notes that this is actually the first time in the history of world literature where anyone asserted that all human beings are actually equal. In fact, he writes, in Christ Jesus, you say that line that Paul used, in Christ Jesus, it's like this ultimate cosmic reality. There can be, I love this, no power relationships. In Christ Jesus, there can be no power dynamics, no power relationships. The primitive church was the world's first egalitarian society. So unique. Just a complete novelty on the landscape of ancient history. Where did they get that? Where did that come from? And the answer is, because they followed a Messiah, someone they called Lord, who took off his sandals and tunic and wrapped himself in a towel like a slave and got on his hands and knees to scrub the crust off of his disciples' feet like a slave would do. And this Jesus said things like, hey guys, you know how those who are regarded as rulers, the nobility class, you know how the nobility class functions among the nations? And of course they would be like, yeah, how they lord it over, the high officials exercise authority over, and they're like, yeah, of course, Jesus, that's kind of the point of power. Haven't you read Plato? And we're looking forward to it, I think, like when that can happen for us. And Jesus shakes his head and says, no. Not so with you. Not in this community. Not in this movement. Instead, we're flipping the ladder upside down or right side up, as it may be. Whoever wants to be great, they become the servant. Whoever wants to be first, they become like the slave of all, and they believed him. And they took that seriously, and they wrote those words down. And as the Jesus movement spread, they would take those words and they would copy them, and the words moved with the movement. And men and women of all walks of life climbed down off of their ladders and joined these communities. And as they did so, this is an amazing, amazing statement. They made slaves their brothers and sisters. Now, roughly between 20 to 50% of the Roman Empire at different times were slaves, which means there's a likelihood that if you had been born at that time, you might have been one. And slaves had no rights. They always ate last, if anything. They picked the garbage out. Like, they had nothing. They couldn't even wear shit. Imagine being a slave and walking into one of these gatherings for your first time. And there's historical evidence for this. A noble person, a leader in the city meets you at the door and gets down on her or his hands and knees and washes your feet. How awkward you are feeling, how like, am I getting punked right now? Like, is something really bad gonna happen to me because this is wrong? Like, this is wrong. And then they invite you to sit next to, there's a Jewish family right there, and you've never been in a room with a Jewish family because typically they wouldn't even, they would not associate this like kosher, not kosher. And there they are, and they're sharing this experience with you, and there's a free person. And then you recognize a couple of other slaves from your community, and they're sitting there too. And there's a citizen wearing a free person's cap, and they're bringing you your food before he or she even sits down and eats. This happened over and over and over again, and they call each other brother and sister, and it meant something. They were family together, and then they start to call you brother and you, sister. In fact, in about 140 AD, a philosopher in Athens named Aristides wrote, "Any slaves they may have among them, they persuade to become Christians because of their love towards them. They want them as part of their family, and they became brothers like each other without discrimination, with no discrimination whatsoever." And this is unheard of. Now, we're going to pack a little bit more of this next week as we talk about Jesus, justice, and racial equality, but no one in the history of the world had ever seen a community like this. It did not exist. All the lines were erased. All of the lines were erased because we follow someone who said the last shall be first and the first shall be last, and the greatest among you will be the least, and the least will be the greatest, and they believed him. They believed him, and they took that seriously. And so, though they were misunderstood and persecuted, and even that in and of itself was considerably misunderstood and considered dangerous to the social fabric, they just outloved everybody. They just outloved everybody. And they served the poor and the outcast. Now, there's so much documentation on this. These Christian communities, this thing that ended up being called the ecclesia, or the English word is the church, was a place where poor and destitute and outcasts and the forgotten of humanity were welcomed and included and again treated as equals, and their needs were cared for. All kinds of historical documentation. There are stories from the ancient world, from the first few centuries, of people in these communities who cared so much about the poor in their community, those who had even less than they had, that even though many times some of them were poor, it would not be unusual at all for most of our families to only have one meal a day, and for that to be a pretty slight meal to begin with. And even though that might have been part of their story, there's story after story of Christian families, get this, fasting for 2 days as they would be nearing their gathering on the Lord's Day on Sunday. Christian families fasting, the word fasting means going without food at all, for 2 days. And can you imagine being the mom or the dad and like, yeah, are we not eating because we don't have food? Oh, we have a little. No, we're not eating because we're saving it up for people who have less than us, so that when we come to the gathering, we have more to share. What? Who does that? Would you? I don't know that I would. Can you even imagine? Never been anything like this ever in the history of the world, because theirs was a community whose leader had said, "Blessed are the poor. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven," who said his own mission was to preach or proclaim good news to the poor, who told his followers the story of a king who separated all of the people in his kingdom into two groups. And to one of the two groups, he said this: "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger. I was new to town. I came into the city. I knew no one. I was all by myself. I had no connections, no support, and you invited me in. You brought me into your home. You made me part of your family. I needed clothes. I hardly had anything. I was threadbare. I was freezing, shivering at night, and you clothed me. I was sick. You nursed me. You looked after me. Truly, I tell you," he says, "whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did to me." The least of these, the least of these. He creates a new category. of humanity that had never really existed as a defined category before. The idea that the least of those among us should be treasured and elevated and cared for. In fact, greater than that, in Jesus' story, somehow the king himself is uniquely present and represented by that kind of person. It is what one writer called a Copernican revolution of humanity. It was a complete 180 from the way the world actually worked. And they believed him. They believed him. They took that seriously, and they did it. And they simply outloved everybody. Another one, number 4, they elevated women and children. Now, it is impossible, really, for us to put ourselves in the ancient mindset towards women and children because our mindset has been so transformed. Both were considered in the ancient world to be inferior, just blatantly so, an economic drain. And if you happen to be born both, you were female and a child, you were born obviously as a child, but if you happen to be female and a child, then you were just doubly so, like inferior and a drain, so much so that in most Greek and Roman families in the ancient world, infant girls were simply abandoned. They called it, the word they had for it was exposed, left out on a garbage dump or a dunghill or dropped into a sewage drain, newborn baby girls and any baby who had any kind of deformity. In fact, there was a study in the ancient city of Delphi. You've probably heard of Delphi before. 600 families on record. Only 6 of those families had ever raised more than one girl. 1/100th of the families had allowed more than one girl to live and to have raised them. And then there's a lot of stories about this from the ancient world as well. Nefarious sorts would know where these sites were. In fact, anyone leaving their baby on a site like this would assume that this is the kind of thing that could happen to that baby. They would troll these sites and they would scoop up these girls and they would raise them to be slaves and prostitutes or cripple them to be beggars. If you ever saw the movie Slumdog Millionaire, that was just a normal scenario in the ancient world. That was just common. In fact, this kind of thing happened so much that there are hundreds of ancient names from this period of time that are variations of the Greek word kopros, which is their word for dung. And then there was this community. There were these communities. There's a book written by a Norwegian scholar named O.M. Bakke. The O.M. stands for Odd Mange. I'd go by O.M. too. That's a good call. Odd Mange Bakke. But Bakke writes, the ancient world had no clear conception of childhood. Childhood wasn't a thing like we do, and therefore violence, infanticide, leaving a child to die of exposure if it wasn't wanted, the sexual use of children, the physical exploitation of children, it didn't just exist. It was an accepted and normal part of culture. In fact, it was talked about quite openly, and it was even encouraged by such brilliant minds as Plato and Aristotle and many others. But then there were these odd communities of people who remembered that their leader had welcomed children and had blessed them. And famously, in one argument that he had with his disciples, were having this argument about greatness and who's really great. And check this out. Jesus, in response to their argument, he calls a little child in and places him in the middle of the circle. And then he says to these grown men, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like this child, like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. A kingdom for children, before Walt Disney. Imagine that. And often this statement is taken or thought or said to refer to some kind of maybe faith like a child or childlike faith. That phrase never exists. Jesus never holds naive or simple faith up as an ideal that we should pursue. He's not talking to them about their faith. He's talking to them about their status, about the way they approach power. In fact, he goes on, this becomes really clear. He says, and therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child, because see, children were the very bottom of the social ladder. They didn't hold the status that they do for us. When you become like them, that's the one who's great in this kingdom. He looks at their ladders and he says, you guys have everything backwards. You look at everything with this inverted lens. It's all wrong. You need to flip it over. And then he goes so far as to say, and whoever welcomes, whoever takes in, Whoever loves and includes and welcomes such a child in my name, they welcome me. And they believed him. They believed him and they took him seriously. And so Christians began, get this, they began to rescue children from the streets, from the garbage dumps, from the dunghills, and they would raise them not to be slaves or prostitutes. They raised them as their own, as their very own children. It is where we get the idea of adoption, which did not exist before them. And it was just confusing to the world around them. Like, why? Why would you do that? Eventually, some cities had so many orphans because the average lifespan was so brief and so many people died still having young children. There were so many orphans in many of these cities that they actually began to fund and build homes for them, where they would create family and they would create homes for dozens and dozens of children. They created the world's first orphanages because they followed a master who blessed children and said, if you welcome them, you welcome me. The book by Baki that I mentioned has a fascinating title. The title is When Children Became People, The Birth of Childhood in Early Christianity. But not only were little girls safer and more likely to survive, just to be raised to live in Christian homes and communities, when they grew up to be women, when they grew up to be young women, historians repeatedly confirm they universally enjoyed higher status, greater dignity, more protection, more respect. They were less likely to be sold into marriage in their adolescence. They had more what we would call rights, though they would never use that word, than all of their pagan counterparts in their own homes, in their marriages, and in their gatherings, in their communities. So revolutionary that we might actually come back to this a bit later in the series. But where did they get that idea? Where did Christians get this idea? We would consider this self-evident. Of course, women and children are of equal value to men. Of course, but historically speaking, that ideal has not been self-evident at all. In fact, Plato might look at you and say, really? I don't think so. Where would you get that? Where did we get that? Well, we got it from Jesus, who welcomed women and treated them as his equal and gave them dignity and welcomed children. And so these Christians elevated women and children. Historians are unanimous in that women flocked to Christianity in the ancient world. And of course they did. It was the best deal on the planet for them. One more thing, and then we'll wrap it up. They cared for the sick and dying. They cared for the sick and dying like no one ever had. In 165 AD, there was an epidemic that historians think was probably smallpox. It broke out. It spread like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire. Get this, within 15 years, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population of the empire had died, including the emperor himself, Marcus Aurelius. The same thing happened in about 250, mid-3rd century, mid-200s AD, with another epidemic. Historians think it might have been measles. Emptied whole towns, just everyone dying. Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine the terror and the panic? As concerned as we got about COVID, imagine 1/4 of the population of the county, not just 1/4 of the people who got sick, like 1/3 of the population of the state dying, like within that period of time. This created such fear, such terror. The people, you bet, fled the cities, left their sick family members and neighbors to die. One ancient writer named Dionysius describes what he said was the common everyday response to people getting sick. He says on the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away. And after COVID, you can imagine people like, you get away from me. I'm leaving this house. Like they pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead and treating unburied corpses like dirt. They didn't want to touch the dead. They didn't want to bury the dead, hoping to somehow avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. Dionysius says that was the common response. And we can imagine that it would be. And then there's this uncommon movement, these uncommon communities whose leader had healed the sick and touched the lepers and the unclean and the untouchable. Following Dionysius, he goes on, he says, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, like loyalty, Why loyalty? These are people you don't even know. You're reaching out to neighbors. You're moving into towns where people are fleeing. What do you mean loyalty? Why is that being loyal? They showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another, heedless of danger. They took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life. So hold on. So I wanted that to end a little differently. What do you mean with them departed this life? So they all, like they were dying while they were helping others? That doesn't seem fair. With them departed this life serenely happy, for, he goes on, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. In fact, Dionysius goes on to mention a number of people that he knew personally who had died in such a way. Just imagine the scene as thousands of people are understandably fleeing for their lives from towns and cities all across the ancient empire. There are these communities of men and women going in or staying in to love and to care for and to nurse and to bury with dignity and respect those who are being left behind by their own loved ones, and like the Jesus whom they followed, took upon themselves the disease and the death so that other people could live. And there was nothing romanticized about this. There was nothing like naive about it. There was no martyr complex. They were very frank about what they knew they were doing. In fact, Cyprian of Carthage, who was a contemporary of Dionysius, says in one letter, "We are learning not to fear death." That's what we're doing. We are learning not to fear death. And they did it. Unthinkable. They did it because, again, they followed a Lord and a Master who said, "When I was sick, you looked after me. That was me on that bed. That was me dying in that road. That was me there. I tell you the truth, whatever you did to the least of these, you did it for me." And they believed him. And they took that seriously. And so ultimately, they began to create hospitals, not just to care for people individually, but they wanted to care for everybody, regardless of wealth or status or rank or ability to pay. And so they began to create hospitals, the world's first ever hospitals, to care for the sick, to care for all of the sick, including, by the way, lepers, who were universally feared and ostracized in the ancient world. Lepers and sick and dying and prisoners and slaves and poor and women and children, they simply outloved everyone. They simply outloved everyone. In fact, one writer, right around the turn of the 3rd century in the late 100s, puts it this way. I love this. It is our care for the helpless. It is our practice of loving kindness that, what do these two words, say those with me? Brands us. That's our brand. That's our brand. It is our care for the helpless. It is our loving kindness that brands us in the eyes of many of our opponents. Only look, they say. Only look at how they love one another. I don't know about them. I don't believe what they believe. They're kind of weird. They don't believe in the gods. They do some weird stuff. But man, look how they love. Look at how they love one another. By this, people will know that you are my disciples. And so, persecuted, ostracized, misunderstood, often hated, for much of the time officially opposed and oppressed by the Roman state, the Jesus movement grew and grew, and it grew largely because of love. Because of love. They simply did more good to more people and loved more humbly and selflessly and sacrificially than anybody had ever seen anyone love before. In other words, they took Jesus seriously, and they changed the world. They took Jesus seriously, and they changed the world. In fact, you could say they took Jesus seriously, and they created our world, because they did. It's difficult to imagine the world if they hadn't. Because almost all of our highest ideals, from justice and charity, I mean, justice existed, but you can see they had a very different idea of justice than we do. Our idea of justice, charity, compassion, humility, mercy, generosity, equality, freedom, the way we view the poor or people with disabilities or the sick, women, widows, children, the whole idea of childhood, the value of human life, the way we sense that our obligation is not to take advantage of or discard, but to actually care for and protect people who aren't able to do that for themselves. Institutions, I didn't even get to this, like schools and universities and hospitals and orphanages, all of it came from them. We have all been shaped by Jesus and his movement, whether we believe in him or not. And it continues to be true today, that wherever, historically speaking, and this continues to be true, wherever the Jesus movement takes root, and I say that very intentionally, not Christianity, not the religion, not people who call themselves Christian, but people who take Jesus seriously and they're genuinely seeking to follow in his way, wherever that takes root, human flourishing follows. It always follows. Human life is better. The water level rises for all of the boats. And if you're a Jesus follower, not a Christian, if you're a disciple, if you're a Jesus follower, listen, this is us. This is who we are. This is our DNA. This is our story. And this is ours now to carry forward. And skeptic or not, you're invited to be a part of that. And millennials, I'll just take a second for this real quick. You were made for this, I think. You are the justice generation, for crying out loud. God designed you and your generation, I believe, to play a role in the next stage of this unfolding story and this global movement, to join the story, elevating justice and freedom, healing the sick, caring for the poor, fighting for human rights and human flourishing for all. And so can I encourage you? Don't let your life's journey be based on the far too many examples of Christians failing to be who we are, to live up to what we have set in motion, to love as Jesus did. Don't walk away. Don't distance yourself from this calling because of them. If you want to change the world, if you want to change the world in all the right ways, there is no better leader and no better mentor to follow than the original Jesus. But I don't expect to have convinced you yet. We just started. I hope I convinced you perhaps to maybe come back next week as we talk about Jesus, justice, and racial equality as our Jesus Skeptic series continues. But let me close this in prayer very quickly. Heavenly Father, I pray that your name really would be incredibly honored and held in high esteem, and that your kingdom, this right side up kingdom, truly would flourish and your will would actually be done in this messed up world just as it is in heaven. And I pray that it would be done through us, that we would take our place, our role in the next stage of this movement and joining you in transforming the world that you love. I pray that for myself. I pray that for all of us in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, hey, before you take off, before we go outside and have a lot of fun, I just want to quickly remind you, Lyle was mentioning to you those Connect cards. We would love to hear from you. Again, if you're our guest, thank you, wow, so much for spending part of your weekend with us. We're so honored, just as much as you feel comfortable filling out, and let us know how we can be praying for you. You can drop these Connect cards in the baskets on their way out. While you're doing that, don't forget we got a Terra Nova Tours coming up in a couple weeks. Just write Tour Me somewhere on that Connect card. We'll get you into play on that. And of course, you can drop your offering envelopes in there as well, and you can give online and on our app. And as we always say, hey, if you got anything out of today, or it's like, hey, you were talking really fast, I want to see that again, or I want to share that with somebody, I know somebody who might benefit from that, you can share it with them on our YouTube channel, youtube.com, Our Terra Nova, and maybe, just maybe, invite them back with you next week for part 2 of the series. In fact, there are these invite cards that are all around you that you can take with you and use to do just that. And I hope we see you again next weekend as Jesus Skeptic continues. God bless you guys. Have a fantastic week. And if you're hanging outside, I will see you there in just a couple minutes.